Professor Van Creveld, generals, ladies, gentlemen, Shalom Bokatov. It is a great pleasure to be back in Israel. I think this is my 6th or my 7th trip. I first came here as a kibbutz volunteer many years ago. So long ago, it was almost when Professor Van Creveld published his first book. Not quite. He beat me by a few months. I am not a military historian, but I do believe in searching our history for evidence of what has worked and what should work again in the future. I am not an air power theorist. Indeed, I reject a large role for any large, abstract, explicit theory of any kind which do not reflect the known facts. However, I do claim some knowledge of the logic and dynamics of collective armed violence, how that relates to human behavior, whether that behavior is individual or collective. As per my introduction, I do have some knowledge of insurgency and terrorism. Whilst I was in the British Army, I wrote its early campaign study of Northern Ireland. It was published in 2006, and I will refer to it subsequently. Since then, I have advanced my thinking. In fact, that remark is almost a direct quote from Professor Van Creveld, and it is taken from the introduction to our study. Professor, thank you for your kind words. But I do not pretend that just because the British Army was once successful in counterinsurgency, that the British Army knows all about it. In fact, I think the professor was too generous in his remarks. But I do suggest that because I have looked at one campaign in depth and breadth, I am reasonably well qualified to look elsewhere and make conclusions. And indeed, much of what I will go on to say was prompted by discussions which I had with IDF officers in Israel in 2007, immediately after the Second Lebanon War. So, what can we say, first of all, about the logic of small wars? Let's first look about how combat works as an interaction. I looked in vain for a good description, and then I came up with this. Where are my slides? Sorry, can we have the slides back on the main projector, please? Thank you. Please take a moment to look at that. I put that up to a number of audiences at various institutions. A lot of them are military men and women, and I usually find the vast majority of them are nodding in broad agreement. Combat warfare is adversarial, dynamic, complex. It is fundamentally human. But, and this is the point I would make to everybody most importantly in this room, combat warfare is evolutionary. It evolves. People make remarks about fighting the first battle of the next war like the last battle of the previous war. Well, actually, if you think about it, that might be a good thing. Because sometimes the alternatives are a very bad thing. But anyway, if you want to know where that remark comes from, please buy this book. Anyway, logically, let's look at cases. What is the taxonomy of warfare? In a light-hearted kind of manner, I think you can come up with 4 cases. The 2 down at the bottom are important, but particularly the last one. And in a light-hearted sort of way, we can call that a big war. We can call that a war. I would call that one a short war. But this is the one that we're talking about. These are the cases that we are talking about. Small wars where powerful nations have difficulty. And I would observe a fundamental logical paradox. It is absolutely logically paradoxical that large developed nations sometimes cannot easily beat a small nation or sub-state actor. And I know from what I've heard in translation that those are the conflicts of interest to you and which we are referring today. When we look at these, quite simply, the larger nation cannot commit violence in a manner which forces the other actor to give up, concede, or whatever you want to call it. And that is a fundamental question. Why not? Now, I suggest to you that there is, in some way, an evolutionary niche. that some way or other, and in every single case it varies, but Professor Van Creveld has already pointed one out in Libya in 1911, that the other side, sorry, I'll come back to that in a moment. I'll go through that and come back to it. The evolutionary niche is as follows. It's an environment, usually social, cultural, whatever, where the larger power cannot, in practice, commit violence effectively. I'll come back to the definition of power in a moment. Those niches have a number of human aspects. They might be social, they may be cultural, they may be religious, they may be legal, economic, and so on and so forth. And they vary in every single case. But the real problem is not that of violence, it's about politics and power. Now, I am not talking about the dynamics of the Houses of Parliament. I am not talking about the dynamics of Hetzliya Town Council. I am actually talking about politics in the sense of the power to get things done. And people often confuse the two. They say, oh, such and such a war is not a matter of politics, it's a matter of religion. Dead wrong. It's a matter of politics in the sense that one party, which has a particular religious fundamentalist view, wants to impose that view on others. That is a matter of power. That is a matter of politics. And please remember my definition as I continue. Those niches that I spoke about are in some manner evolutionary. The adversary, usually the weaker adversary, evolves because it has to, because it faces an evolutionary threat. If you think about those poor Libyan tribesmen, if they did not adapt and evolve, they would get bombed out of wherever they were. They had to evolve, they did. Now, by definition, the resolution of those conflicts will not be achieved by committing violence. I'm not saying that violence doesn't have a part to play, but resolving those issues will not be achieved by committing violence. It will require some form of political development, And that will affect some of those issues that I've spoken about. I could give you the examples of Northern Ireland. It doesn't really matter. I could give you almost any other major conflict that you've heard of. It will tend to affect some of those. And often, because politics and power are enshrined in legal frameworks, those issues will involve and include legal issues. So let's talk about aircraft and small wars. I said a moment ago that resolution of those conflicts will require political development. Here is a question. How does the use of aircraft affect that? It doesn't. It's irrelevant to that. Why am I going backwards? Excuse me a moment. Right, but let's clarify, and don't feel bad about this as airmen. Do aircraft have utility in small wars? Of course they do. Do aircraft give us an asymmetric advantage, and usually to the larger and more developed power? Of course they do. Can the larger and more developed power lose despite the extensive use of air power? I think Professor Van Creveld has made that point very eloquently a few moments ago. But can aircraft and the use of aircraft have any relevance in the resolution of those evolutionary niches? No. Do not feel bad about that. The British Army was employed in Northern Ireland for, I think, in total 39 years. From 1979 to the end of the conflict in 2006, the British uniformed army did not kill a single terrorist. Not one. Be grateful to get the projector back up again. From what little I know of the IAF in Israel's small wars, have you done everything that could reasonably be asked of you? Yes. When we talk, for example, just as a case in point about Northern Ireland, it is said that the British Army drove the terrorists, quote, underground. We meant that metaphorically. In the case of the Israeli Air Force, I mean that literally. You have forced them to operate underground. You have done an amazing amount. Your adversaries have been forced into evolutionary niches. And as a friend of mine who's present today in this room pointed out, when, for example, Hezbollah tried to come out and start firing rockets again, you closed it down. They're in an evolutionary niche, and it is difficult for them to get out. You have played a major role in that. But please do not expect that aircraft and the use of aircraft will have a major role in resolving that conflict. It won't. A few words, and only a few words, about air power. It is an abstract noun, and I think this gives people a lot of problem. That is a pen. I'm a man. This is a room. You are people. Those are concrete nouns, and we can be very clear that we all understand what we're talking about, and we all agree. The moment you get into abstract nouns, people disagree or use the definition to their own purposes. It is also an anomaly. We do not talk in terms of land power, and we rarely talk in terms of sea power in the same way. And if it's an anomaly, as a logical person, this should be telling you something about its use. What it comes to, fundamentally, is about the use of aircraft by armed forces. And if you're talking about that, I have no difficulty with it. But the moment people start going beyond that, they start making all sorts of assumptions, many of them explicit, that I would not necessarily agree with. It may be not just the use, but the effects of the use of, but that's logically trivial. Air Chief Marshal Sir Stephen Dalton, the head of the Royal Air Force, said, and I quote, air power has always been a difficult concept to define. How very, very useful if you are an Air Force general trying to fight battles in a defence ministry. That is the working definition that Britain and I believe that NATO uses. I think that's fairly reasonable, but the abstract concept and the bit that we can differ over is the word power. And it's suitably ambiguous, and it's used by a lot of people in different ways, and many of them are useful to their purposes. We won't go into them here. Some observations, and then to conclude. As the professor has pointed out, big countries sometimes have difficulty in defeating smaller actors where those actors occupy evolutionary, social, cultural niches. And I put it to you that that's effectively where some of your adversaries sit right now. That situation is not resolved by committing violence, because they have put themselves in places where they are effectively, for that time being, immune from violence. That situation, if it is ever resolved, may be resolved by political change. Just to go back to Northern Ireland for a moment, Mrs. Thatcher, Prime Minister of Great Britain for something like 14 years, made absolutely no political movement for Northern Ireland, and that's one of the reasons why it lasted for 37, 38, 39 years. The moment that John Major took over from them, political change started to happen. And those things may well affect social, cultural, religious, legal, or economic issues. The main thing as it happens in Northern Ireland was legal, but that doesn't really matter. The military use of aircraft, the narrow definition of air power, is irrelevant to that process. Collective armed violence, be it on the land, be it sometimes at seas, be it in the air, is usually necessary to contain the situation and then to allow political development. Again, by analogy with Northern Ireland, although the British Army didn't kill anyone in 16 years, they had to be there to contain the level of development so that when political change did take place, it did so in a peaceful environment. Using aircraft, military use of aircraft does have utility. And at a tactical level and possibly an operational level, it may be absolutely critical. But using that word air power sometimes gets in the way of things because it is often used in terms of institutional politics. Air power, if you define it widely, is irrelevant to the resolution of small wars. But I stress the resolution. Because the only relevant form of power which aircraft can deploy in these circumstances is violence, and evolutionary niches are not resolved by committing violence. Thank you very much.